An average of 90% of the oceans around South Africa are under lease for oil and gas exploration or extraction. Applications for these exploratory and extractive drilling rights by oil and gas giants are being approved. However, there are also objections by many stakeholders, including NGOs, coastal communities and fishers. Dr. Jean Harris is a strategic head of the Wild Oceans program at WILDTRUST, and she joins us for a conversation about this subject. Dr. Harris, thank you for making time for us. Do you think we have a realistic oil spill model to evaluate these risks and impacts that are often raised as concerns by those objecting to the drillings and explorations? And if not, what have we been using then as a measure to see what the impact could be?
Good afternoon to you and your viewers, and thank you for having me here. Yes, in terms of oil spill models, obviously in terms of the environmental impact assessments required when a company wants to do drilling in our oceans, the consultants for the industry have produced some sort of oil spill model in that case. But the difference with this oil spill model is it is really developed by an independent objective team, an international team, including Dr. Giles Fearon from SAON, the South African Environmental Observation Network, using our South African oceanographic data, the real data, looking at hindcasting, so that it's really simulating mathematically, using our oceanographic data and running many simulations to work out what the risk is and where the oil would move to. So that's the very useful advance on previous ones.
Tell us more about the oil spill model for South Africa's exclusive economic zone. What model are you aiming to develop here?
So the model has been developed already, and that's essentially it's a mathematical model that uses the oceanographic data from our oceans around South Africa, from the west. And what's really interesting about it is that we know that our east coast, south coast, and west coast are very different. So it uses the actual data from our different coasts and essentially looks at the known studied behavior of oil and looks at if you dropped oil in that spot on our oceans, what is the trajectory? Where do we think where will it go? What's the most likely route it's going to take? Might it hit the coast, or will it go far out to sea? And is it different at different times of year? So essentially it gives us multiple times modeled what the most likely scenarios are for us should there be an oil spill, and it would be different in different parts of the ocean because it's obviously dependent on currents, water temperature, etc.
Okay, so this can really then be of great assistance, right? Because if you have a model that can predict the nature, the behavior, the trajectory of oil spilled from offshore oil and gas extraction, you then have this realistic scenario for future assessments when it comes to the environmental, social and economic risk of these major blowouts and routine spills from these drilling sites. Is government going to use this model? Because you're saying it's already been developed. How do you think it's going to broadly assist us, even a government, when it approves the applications that often come from these big corporations for explorations?
So certainly we have already contributed this model over the last weeks to the Department of Forestry, Fisheries and Environment, to the relevant people who deal with pollution control. And we see this as a very key tool. For example, when the decision makers have to make a decision on whether to grant an environmental authorization, i.e. to let oil drilling happen, or when, people who are very concerned about an environmental authorization or permit being given, when they appeal to the minister can then use something like this to have an independent evaluation rather than just the industry's consultant's oil spill. It's an independent assessment. We're particularly concerned with the deep water drilling that really amps up the risk that we're seeing in terms of oil and gas exploration. Because in our coastline, particularly look here off our east coast where we have these 6 oil sites, awarded to Sasol and ENI, most contested at the moment. Those are in high current areas in thousands of meters of water. So the risk of an oil spill, even though the probability might be lower, the impact, should it actually happen, could be catastrophic. And this oil spill actually shows where if there was an oil spill from those specific sites, or from one on the south coast, where the oil would go to. So one essentially provides the minister or decision makers with eyes wide open as to what the risks could be. But it's also available to the NGOs and the public and the scientists so that they can also interrogate it. And if they're wanting to comment on an authorization, an EIA, then, they could also refer to it. Yeah.
Just help us understand what would be the consequences. So if the oil does spill in our waters, what would be the consequences for, just the ocean's ecosystem?
Yes. So there's multiple impacts and consequences, and it really depends on where that oil goes. So if it was at a time when if one could assume it was mostly swept offshore, then, one might then be more concerned about the oceanographic system organisms, the whales and the seabirds and the offshore fisheries. But if it comes across to our coast, which was very interesting in this particular modeling exercise, the one that came from the East Coast, it actually sweeps down and bumps into the coast, probability of coming into the coast over some of the marine protected areas, actually all the way down into the South Coast area and a little bit wrapping into the West Coast, which was quite a surprise. Now you can imagine we've got marine protected areas which are sensitive, important sites that were already identified for protection. They're in the path of this oil. For example, fisheries, important fisheries on the South Coast and the Eastern Cape could also be impacted on it. If it lands on the shoreline, then, you've all seen those pictures of, birds and beaches full of oil. That essentially, has got the high risk of causing, high mortalities, die-offs of fish, of seabirds. And, one of the concerns would be, for example, the penguins, our very endangered African penguins, which lie in the path of, along our coastal areas. So there's high consequence. Also think about tourism. If we had a big oil spill, what that impact would be. But we're not only concerned about a big blowout. An oil rig out there, if the currents are going to, as this model shows, can bring it inshore, then we worry about, the incidental spills when a pipe is coupled and uncoupled and there's a smaller spill that might normally not go noticed. Now, those could be swept along our coast and we would have additional fouling. But again, I said, we're concerned in these deep ones that are in the very high current. Yeah.
Let's look at the applications to explore and extract oil and gas, because those are subjected to an environmental impact assessment process. Do you think that's enough? Because the argument by some people is that process often underrepresents the likely negative environmental impact. It doesn't also assess climate risk, and it's funded by the very same industry applicants.
Yes, it's quite a contentious issue, and as you will know, there are quite a large number of applications for both the initial exploration phase, which is the seismic surveys, as well as the actual then exploration when they want to put the exploratory drills down, even before you get to the extraction phase. And at the moment, there's quite a strong lobby to try to create a robust review in environmental authorizations. So you're seeing quite a lot of contestation from experts who are, essentially speaking up when NGOs take these on review, try to get a review. You saw the two seismic surveys, the Shell survey and the Searcher survey on the West Coast, interdicted and stopped in the middle of the survey. Now, in the oil case, where an authorization has been issued, for example, for this ENI Sasol, there's currently a court proceeding going on around that because, quite a lot of scientists believe that was the wrong decision.
Okay. How complex was it, Doctor, developing this model? Because often you hear of just the complexity of the oceanographic features, and I'm just wondering how complex that process was, developing the model.
Yes, it was quite complex. And as you will know, there are quite a lot of scientists believe that was the wrong decision. Okay. How complex was it, Dr., developing this model? Because often you hear of just the complexity of the oceanographic features, and I'm just wondering how complex that process was, developing it, the model. Yes, it is a complex process. There are a lot of variables to look into. So I myself am a marine ecologist, not a oceanographer or mathematician. But so hence we had a team of mathematicians and oceanographers and modelers to work on this. So Dr. Giles Fearon of SAON, he headed the team and was supported by international experts, some of them that have been involved in the Horizon Deep oil spill and actually therefore had first-hand knowledge of how oil behaves and in the ocean. So it's a complex question, and of course it's only simulating it. They ran this over and over and over again once they'd developed the model to see what the different iterations would be and to try to make it as robust as possible. But of course, it depends on weather, on currents, and so they model it using all those different factors. But it can be over time improved and tweaked on as we go. But this is the first one that we think is independent, objective, and uses the real data from our waters here.
All right, and it's good to know that it can be used by even government when it assesses these applications, but also NGOs who often want to object to some of the applications for exploration. Dr. Jean Harris, Strategic Head of the Wild Oceans Program there at WILDTRUST, thank you for joining us for this important conversation.